Hello, my name is Scott Floyd. Welcome to the Data Flags webinar. Today we will discuss data flags and how they are configured and how they can be used to generate alarms and other reporting conditions. We're going to be covering not a lot of material, but quite a bit. So if you have any questions in the end, I would prefer if you would send them to support@envirosys.com. Again, that's support@envirosys.com, and maybe mention the Data Flags webinar, and I will try to answer those questions today if possible. Flags and conditions, we have validation, alarm, informational, calibration flags, and the data controller stores data flags along with numerical averages. These data flags describe error conditions or alarms that took place during the averaging interval. Validation process described above allows the user to set up certain limits and conditions under which data can be flagged for informational purposes and validated, or both. Flags are used to apply informational purposes and validation, or both. The field is used. Flags describe error conditions or alarms that took place during the averaging interval. Each channel has flags applied for different events, calibrations, offline, etc. Instantaneous validation flags are not included in the averaging, and they will invalidate your base average data and indicates if the data is valid or invalid, not included. The average validation flags are used in averaging for alarming and informational purposes, such as your H flag for alarms, L flag for low limit alarms, and the G, V, W, X, Y, and Z are informational flags. Flag overrides can be applied to make non-validation become validation flags, but validation flags cannot be turned off. I'll stress on this point later in the webinar, but I would leave flag overrides alone for now. Again, like I said a while ago, in validation flags, the data is not included when these flags are on your minute data. These flags, the average flags, the H, L, and others in the informational the data is included, does not invalidate your data. And these are typical on your 1 minute, 15 minute, and 1 hour averages. All instantaneous validation and the V through Z flags will be seen on the instantaneous, base average, average 1, and average 2. It does propagate down. For example, if COPPM has a B flag, of course, COPPM would be used in CO pounds per hour, CO pounds per million. That B flag will be propagated over to the calculated parameter. The out of control flag, the T flag, will invalidate hourly data, and that's no exceptions to that, except when you're offline. It propagates to the base average, instantaneous, average 1, and average 2. And it does propagate down, again, like if COPPM is out of control, it will propagate to the CO pounds per hour. All the average validation flags will be seen on the base average, average 1, average 2, and these are not propagated to other parameters. If COPPM has an H flag, of course, you won't see that flag propagated up to the CO pounds per hour or CO pounds per million. Again, flag validation defaults, this is in Stack Studio, and you can change that here, but I would advise just leaving this alone. I would leave it at default. There's really not a good reason to make changes here. There are flag validation overrides, and they can be applied to other flags to mark your data in different, for instance, informational flag you can mark in startup, shutdown, or out of control. But I would recommend just using defaults whenever possible because they are applied to the entire configuration. Configuring instantaneous and average validation limits. Only conditions related to digital inputs and limits that invalidate Data are configured and checked on an instantaneous basis. As you'll see, the bad status, M status, offline status, all that is an input pattern, and the same with your informational flags. Same as Stack Studio with the channel settings. This would be your BMF and your informational flags, and all that would be configured with a digital input pattern. Configuring average validation limits. All validations related to averages are configured and checked on each interval. This is your H, your L, rate of change, your C, and the F, lower floor limit and ceiling limit. This is your channel settings in Stack Studio. That would be configured here on the base average, extended 1 and 2. Out of control flags these are applied to any data whose calibration exceeded the configured out of control limit. The interval will be invalid. A lowercase t flag indicates the data was out of control, but the interval was still valid. I just want to say that you will only see a lowercase t on hourly data that is offline. So if you're offline but you're out of control, you will report an uppercase F, a lowercase t, and a greater than. Remember, all offline data is valid on the hourly level. However, on the minute data, we'll still have an uppercase T. And the data will continue to be marked out of control until a passing cal is run. And so in other words, if you're offline, but you have a lowercase t, as soon as you come online, you will be out of control, and it will be marked out of control until you pass an online calibration. Boiler offline flags can be used to validate data during non-operating hours. Hours are valid when the F flag is reported, but offline. It prevents the logger from averaging zeros during non-operating periods needed to correctly calculate emission rates during partial operating hours. The uppercase F indicates a whole hour offline, lowercase p indicates a partial offline. Floor limit flag. This is configured on each individual interval in the channel. Addresses a situation lower than allowed if it falls below the limit that's flagged with a lowercase f and replaced with a floor value. And the same as with the ceiling limit flag. This is a situation of averages higher than allowed. If it falls above the limit, it's flagged with a lowercase c and replaced with a ceiling value. Now, going back to this is useful when your unit is going up or down, and you can have a scenario or a situation where there's a divide by zero where you have 20.9 minus 0.2. Your floor limit can keep that average at a value that's greater than zero, or keeping it from going negative, and the divide by zero or the going negative could cause huge numbers for one interval. So that's the purpose of the ceiling and the floor limit flags. One of the purposes. Okay, this is a logger display. A lot of people don't ever go to the logger and look at that, but that would be from the reading with flags, the DF screen from the home menu, DF. The average validation flags, the H, the L, the floor limit and ceiling limit, they won't show on this DF screen. But you can look at the last base average screen in the data controller. It will show the H, the floor limit, ceiling limit, and you can toggle between intervals using the Control A. Merged channel, and notice this field here, switch on flags and flags to ignore. Merge channel allows two channels to be merged into one. In this case, it's Knox low and Knox high. Knox low is the primary, Knox high is the secondary. Real-time data from the two channels are merged and then averaged. The switch on flags, that's the list of flags that detects the secondary channel's data. Remember, it was the plus flag in the O, and it will switch from the primary to the secondary once that flag appears. The flags from the offline is passed up to the merge from the offline channel. Controller alarms. These alarms are triggered by a validation or informational flag from the data controller. And if you notice this particular one, it triggers off the invalid flag, but ignores the C, M, or F. So in other words, if you have an invalid flag, but you have a C, M, or F flag, it will not trigger. The flags for alarm condition specifies which flag to trigger for the alarm. Choose any of the validation flags. You can choose up to 32 characters. And the same with the ignore state changes. It specifies which flag you want to use to ignore the alarm, and you can use up to 32 characters. Flags for alarm condition. These flags listed were without commas or any other characters in between them. And that's what triggers the controller alarm. Of course, the ignore state prevents the alarm from triggering. And this, for example, if your technician is doing maintenance and he can throw the M flag on the data, and the alarm won't trigger if you have that in that ignore state. And that's useful when they are doing maintenance or maybe even the calibration. Polling alarms use average data values or the data controller flags to trigger an alarm exception based on a specific source parameter averaging interval. As to configure alarms for different averaging intervals. This is for any interval that's in the channels, 1 minute, 6 minute, 15 minute, 1 hour. So data controller flag logic in Stack Studio. These are calibration flags, and this can only be seen in the calibration report in the data controller itself. That does not pull in to data into StackVision. This is an example of the calibration report. In the calibration alarms, remember cal drifts do not put any flags on the average data. They're only seen at the controller, and they can trigger alarms at the controller. I want to know if anybody knows what this is, what these settings are. I see a few hands raising up. This is an analog output setting in the data controller. That is a physical card in the data controller that can send a 4 to 20 milliamp signal to a device or another controller. Typically, it's sent to DCS. Most plants have a DCS system, and they may want to see calculated gas parameters from the data controller, and you can use that as your input parameter to the analog output setting, and then scale it appropriately, and then send that signal to a DCS. But what this is here, the action when flagged is whenever your input parameter is flagged in some way, you can do some sort of action. By default, it's ignore, where it just sends the data anyway. So your DCS will actually see the morning calibrations, 0 and the span. So some people want to do some sort of action when flagged, if it's out of control, maybe, or when it's flagged with a C flag. The low val just simply puts the engineering unit or the value to 0. The hold will actually just hold the last good value it had when the flag appeared on the data. Ignore, of course, we just ignore, and then, or you can 0 out your milliamps. You can have flags in a condition manager. The condition manager is a task in process now. It's a utility that allows users to check system data conditions, and based on the conditions take specified actions. And like I said, that's in your process now, your hourly, your daily. So it can, you look at the data logger flags that's pulled in. For instance, if in this particular condition, you have a limit parameter called NOC LIM, and if the data logger flag pulls in with an X and it's not invalid, it doesn't have the less than, and it's the parameters greater than the limit parameter, then set the parameter to exceedance. That's just an example of process now using data controller flags to manipulate things. Here we can go through a few troubleshooting steps, and the first example is calibrations. We get a lot of calls about this. Someone will get an average detail report, emailed to them in the morning, and they'll have this, they'll see this data, and they'll, what's going on? Why am I showing invalid? With certain things you can do to troubleshoot that is, you can check your data and calibrations. I mean, your data in CalLab or in Data Lab. You can open CalLab to retrieve and look and see the cal record, check the status of the calibration. Then you bring your O2 data in Data Lab, bring up the hourly data, show the flags of and missing and invalid fields, launch it with a different interval. Now, once you launched it into the minute data, you can look and try to cross-reference the minute data with the C flag and the out of control flag, and it should match up with CalLab. You can cross-reference the next passing calibration with the minute data. The data returns to valid and loses a T flag. Conclusion is this data here is caused of failed calibration. Example 2, just drilling for raw parameters. Bring in the hourly data in Data Lab along with the flags, missing and invalid fields. Take note of the flags. The hourly data is blank and you need to check the parameters calculated. We actually get a few calls on this quite a bit in support. Open SimScape, select the parameter from the dropdown to isolate only the parameter and its constituents. Right-click parameter and select in View a New Window. As you can see, the NH3 core, NH3 corrected parameter does have an equation and all of its constituents are listed. Open network of parameters in Data Lab to drill down to the raw parameters. Take note of the missing and invalid data mask as well as the flags on the raw parameters. Overrange flag coming from Noxlow, need to check calibrations. And at first glance, you'll notice that calibration reports is failing. And that corresponds with the invalid NH3 corrected parameter. Cross-reference minutes with CalLab, timing of the failed calibration matched minutes that have the out of control flag. Conclusion. Example 3 is bad status. We get a lot of support calls for missing invalid opacity data. And according to this report, it looks like practically every interval is invalid. Bring in the 6-minute data for opacity and data lab, along with flags and missing and invalid fields. Data has been flagged with a B status. Bad status is configured in the controller and in Stack Studio, of course. Check for the bad status expression in Stack Studio and in the data controller. In Stack Studio, the expression is 14 equals 0, same as in the controller. Oops, excuse me. And from there, you can run an input line history report. Look at the input 14 and you'll notice that the input 14 is chattering quite a bit. So it usually indicates some sort of problem with the contact on your opacity analyzer. And that's just another way of troubleshooting these alarms and flags. Again, if you have any questions, just I'd rather you send them to support@envirosys.com and I'll try to get to them today. Again, that's support@envirosys.com. That's the end of the webinar.